So a lot of parents and clients come in with primary or secondary concerns with feeding, and there's so much anxiety around the feeding, and parents are so confused because at one hand they really want their child to eat a lot of food, but on the other hand they just want their child to get the calories. And it seems like every person, from your pediatrician to your mother-in-law to the person next to you in a grocery store, has all sorts of advice for feeding. And I kind of want to give you some of the myths that are in feeding to help alleviate that anxiety and a lot of that guilt that parents typically have. So the number one feeding myth that I always hear is that people think that feeding is the number one priority for the child's body, and it's not. The number one priority is breathing. So if that child can't eat and protect their breath or their breathing, or don't feel safe in it, then they're going to choose breathing over feeding or eating. And so when you go in with that mentality that I'm going to make you eat, you're going to want to eat because that's what your body needs, this child is like, I got to protect my body because that food, it's very, very dangerous to dangerous to his ability to breathe or sustain his life. Another common one is that if the child is hungry enough, they're going to eat food. And this is a huge myth that I feel like gets perpetuated, especially with pediatricians. Parents are told if they're not going to eat, well then just withhold food, and eventually they're going to want to eat those foods. But if the child doesn't have the skill to eat those foods, then they're not going to eat those foods. And then if you put on your war helmet and go to battle, you're putting this child in an anxiety state, which guess what? Suppresses his hunger. So now you guys are fighting over food. He's no longer hungry, and you are just in a place that you feel like you're never going to win. Another myth that comes along is that eating is easy, and that is quite the contrary. It is probably one of the hardest sensory experiences for any child. You have smell, you have sight, you have taste, you have texture. I mean, all these sensory systems are involved in the feeding, and it really bombards these kiddos. And if they can't control or modulate or even process the sensory information, it's really sending them over the top, and it sends them to that flight or fight state again, and then you're back into that war and that power struggle with the feeding. So what kiddos do to protect themselves is if they can't process that sensory, they're going to use that primary sensory system of visual. So they're going to see that food, they're going to go, no go. That's dangerous stuff, get it out of here. And then they're right back into that stubborn, I'm going to fight you, we're not going to eat the food. And then another one that comes along is that a lot of people think that with feeding, it's either a behavioral issue or it's an organic cause. So they're being defiant because they want the cookie and they don't want to eat the meat, or the idea is that physically they can't eat the food. And it's never one or the other. It's such a complex process that it's a mixture of all of it. And it may have started as something organic. It may have been regurgitation, or it may have been oromotor, they couldn't handle the food. But then they developed these behaviors to help protect themselves from what they perceived as a child or an infant that they could not do with the feeding. So I feel like if you go in with the mentality and really dispel these myths, you don't feel as guilty when it comes to the feeding experience. And then I very highly recommend for any parent to really look at the motor component that goes into it, the sensory component, and really have a medical professional break down everything that goes into the feeding. Because if it's just you and the child and you guys are fighting, no one wins that fight. And there's so much anxiety behind that, and it's hard to hear these parents come with stories that, I mean, they're just at their wits' end of what to do with this child, and so the child's eating 20 McDonald's chicken nuggets because that's all they'll eat. And we don't want the child to grow up with that mentality of this is the only thing I can eat. And I don't want the parents to come with the mentality that I either have to fight the child or give them what they want. There's always a middle ground, and you should really rely on your medical professionals to provide you that middle ground.